Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my March wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the things that I read in the month of March. So firstly, I apologise for my somewhat croaky voice. I'm recovering from a cold and I feel much better, but my voice doesn't sound it. But anyway, so I read a bunch of books in March. I read 12 books and some really great ones. It was very nice to have a good reading month in March after I feel like my February reading felt a bit disappointing, or like I just didn't get to the things I wanted to get to, whereas in March I read a lot of things that I really wanted to read. So we'll start off with some classics that I read in March, and first off I finally finished rereading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, which I have been reading over the past 3 months for a read-along that I have been hosting, and I really enjoyed rereading Les Miserables, and it's also been really fun to do a read-along of it, so thank you to everyone who took part and who enjoyed the book. I'm so glad that so many people did really enjoy the book. And yeah, if you want to know more of my spoilery thoughts of Les Miserables, I have done 3 videos about it, sort of volume by volume. But overall, I just really enjoyed this. As I said, I have read it before, but about sort of 15, 16 years ago. So it had been a long time and it was a real joy to reread it. I didn't read this physical edition. I listened to the audiobook, and specifically the audiobook of the Christine Donougher translation, which I thought was really good. And in general, I really like Les Miserables. It has the sort of balance that I find in an author like Dickens and love in an author like Dickens, of light and shade, of humour and darkness, of sorrow and fun, of sort of complex social criticism and tension. And I just think Les Miserables is an absolute masterpiece. It is a very long novel following lots of different characters, but the sort of central storyline, I suppose, follows a man called Jean Valjean, who, as a young man, is sent to prison for 20 years for stealing a loaf of bread. And we meet him at the beginning when he's come out of prison. And a particular encounter encourages him to try and build a new life for himself. And we follow him and all of the people he interacts with and encounters. And a lot of the book takes place in Paris in the 1830s, and examines the 1832 attempted failed revolution. And I just think the characterization is amazing in Les Miserables. And I find it such an emotional novel. For me, the sort of heart of it is the relationship between Jean Valjean and Cosette. You know, for me, it is a parent-child novel. Like, that's what's at the heart of it. But there's also so much interesting social criticism, and so many interesting characters. You know, Eponine has my heart, Gavroche. But Javert is also like a fantastic character. Just an utter pleasure to reread. I think this is, yeah, firmly one of my favourite books of all time. Sticking with rereads, I also reread The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, which was this month's book for the Thomas Hardy read-along, being hosted by Jem the Librarian, where we're reading all of Thomas Hardy's works in publication order. I have read The Mayor of Casterbridge several times before, but I really enjoyed this reread. I listened to it on audiobook like mostly over one weekend, which was really nice. And it's just a really powerful novel, really great character study. The Mayor of Casterbridge follows a man called Michael Henchard, who at the very beginning of the book gets really drunk and sells his wife at a country fair. 20 years later, when he has turned his life around, become a teetotaler, and become the mayor of Casterbridge, his wife comes back into his life, and everything kind of goes on from there. And it is just this really complex, wonderful character study. There's not like a single character in the Mayor of Casterbridge that I love in the way I love someone like Gabriel Oak from Far From the Madding Crowd, but I think Michael Henchard is just like such an incredible character study and such a like complicated, flawed but human individual. And I just think he's really well done. And there are so many other points of interest in The Mayor of Casterbridge. So yeah, really enjoyed that one. I would say that The Mayor of Casterbridge for me is like, I think it's one of Thomas Hardy's masterpieces, because he's a great writer, but not every single book of his is a masterpiece in my opinion. But it's not like an absolute personal favourite for me. It would probably be like second tier rather than top tier Thomas Hardy, I suppose. I guess I'm already thinking about like how I will do a tier ranking of all of Hardy's books when I finished rereading them all, which I'm really enjoying doing. So yes, thoroughly enjoyed The Mayor of Casterbridge. Then I also read 2 new to me Victorian novels in March, one of which was Heart and Science by Wilkie Collins, which is a relatively short Wilkie Collins novel about a young man and a young woman who are cousins and fall in love, but her father has left her a fortune that his mother wants to get her hands on. So there's lots of like family tension and secrets, and there's also a subplot involving science and medicine and debates around vivisection in the Victorian period. So I would say that Heart and Science was a middling Wilkie Collins for me, not one of his masterpieces, not one of the absolute misses where I just don't understand his plot decisions at all. Wilkie Collins is a hit or miss author for me, but Heart and Science was quite a sort of middling one. I thought it was good. I thought it was interesting. There was a lot in it that I found interesting to look at, and I think the characterization especially was really interesting, but it wasn't an absolute masterpiece. And I think some of the themes that I found the most interesting in Heart and Science are explored better in The Woman in White, so I wouldn't say it's like a must-read Wilkie Collins. I found it interesting, but yeah, there are other Wilkie Collins I would probably suggest you read first. And the other Victorian book I read in March was The Landleaguers by Anthony Trollope, which was not a big success with me. This is one of my least favourite Anthony Trollope books, which is very sad now that I'm really nearing the end of his body of work. So I have now read 46 out of Anthony Trollope's 47 novels. I have one left, John Caldergate, which I'm going to read in April. I'm very excited for it. I really hope I will like it, because I did not really like The Landleaguers that much. So I think there's a few reasons why I sort of have come away from this book with lots of negative feelings. One is that it is an unfinished novel, which I did know going into it. But I think there were like 12 chapters left. So it's a sort of decent length, but Anthony Trollope had quite a lot left to write, and then he passed away and didn't get to finish it. And there are some plot lines where you can see how they're going to be resolved, but there are other plot lines where you can't. And because he's just sort of finished writing it, it just like abruptly ends in the middle of a chapter. So it's a very unsatisfying unfinished novel. And, you know, I think there are some unfinished novels that I really would recommend reading, such as The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens, because it's so good, or Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, because it's only like missing a few pages and basically finished, it's fine. But The Landleaguers is probably not an unfinished novel I would hugely recommend, because I don't think it's Trollope's strongest work. Otherwise, it's also definitely one of his works that has like aged really, really badly. You know, Anthony Trollope was a Victorian person who had been socialised by the prejudices of his day. And in some of his novels, he really fights against the prejudices of his day. And in this novel, he just indulges in them, which I did find quite frustrating. So there's two sort of plot lines in this book, and both of them had an element in them that I struggled with. So one of the plot lines is about a young woman who is trying to make it as an opera singer in London. And it's about her sort of struggles for financial independence, and also the way women in her position were treated in the Victorian period. Her music teacher, who is in a way her business partner, is attracted to her and, you know, constantly making advances to her that she doesn't want, and her struggles with that is sort of an interesting element of the plot. But her music teacher is Jewish, and the anti-Semitism with which he is written and the anti-Semitism with which she approaches him, like, it's very difficult reading. And I think especially, like, having read Anthony Trollope's book, Nina Balakar, which is a book fighting against anti-Semitism and being really critical of anti-Semitism, it's a bit frustrating that he wrote this later on in life. And then the other half of the plot is set in Ireland and is about the Land League and about disputes and rising tension over land in Ireland. And it's very historically interesting, but I did find that, like, Anthony Trollope's stance was frustrating me in places. And like I said, because this novel isn't finished, I don't know how it would have ended. Like, I don't know exactly what Anthony Trollope was going to do with certain plot lines there. But I do think, like, especially having read a few months ago The McDermotts of Ballycloran, Anthony Trollope's first novel, this being his last one, Anthony Trollope's first novel, The McDermotts of Ballycloran, is also set in Ireland. And in The McDermotts of Ballycloran, young Anthony Trollope was so clearly trying to fight against English prejudices about Irish Catholics in a way that I found, like, really, you know, really refreshing for a Victorian novel. And then in the Landleaguers, he is not doing that. And I feel like I prefer younger Anthony Trollope, passionate for social justice, than older, prejudiced Anthony Trollope. But as I say, also the novel's unfinished, so there may have been things that he was going to do towards the end of the novel that were going to resolve some of those things. I don't know. I just struggled with this book. Yes, it's not that it's not worth reading. There are some really interesting things. I would say that if you want to read a book about the Landleaguers and the Land League in Ireland in the 1880s, a much better book for that is Drama and Muslim by George Moore, which I thought was really good and really interesting. And it was quite a long time ago that I read that, but I found that a much more like complicated take on it than the Landleaguers. I feel like I've been rambling about this for a really long time, but basically this was not my favourite Anthony Trollope. And that makes me very sad because I love Anthony Trollope so much. Obviously there were bits I enjoy because it's Anthony Trollope, I love his writing. There were good bits of the love story, etc. But I just, yeah, not my favourite. Then I also read a few works of historical fiction in March, one of which was A Little Trickery by Rosanna Pike, which I really, really loved. I listened to this on audiobook and it was such a fun read, and I'm so glad that I finally got to this because I know a lot of people have loved it. So this book is set in Tudor England and follows a girl called Tib from her sort of teens into her 20s, and Tib is a vagrant. She doesn't have a home. She has spent her childhood kind of moving from place to place with her mother, and at the beginning of the book her mother passes away and she has to try and fend for herself, and we follow her sort of coming of age story, her trying to build a family and gather people around her, and how she ends up getting involved in a scheme of trickery to get a better life for herself. And it's both like really dark and really miserable and such fun because it's in first person, and Tib has a really distinctive narrative voice, and that just makes it joyous, because it's really funny and really like engaging, and I just loved Tib so much as a character. You just feel so close to her as a character, and I love the themes of found family, and sort of being an outsider, building your own society if you're considered an outsider from main society. I just thought it worked so well. It was such a great read, really emotionally engaging, really fun. I loved the element of trickery in it, and yeah, I just thought it was great. And then the other two works of historical fiction I read were both books from the long list of the World Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So I have done a separate dual review of those two books, talking about them in a lot more detail, so I won't talk about them in too much depth here. But one book that I started in February and finished off in March was Eden Glassy by Melissa Lukashenko. This book is a dual timeline novel set partially in 19th century Australia and partly in 21st century, present day Australia. And in the 19th century section in the 1850s, we're following a young First Nations man, his kind of coming of age story, his love story, his struggles against colonialisation, and his sort of increasing awareness of how colonialisation is changing his society. And then in the 21st century, we're following an elderly woman who, after a fall, ends up in hospital and ends up being donned Queen Land's oldest Aboriginal, and interviewed by lots of papers. And we're following her and her relationship with her granddaughter, who is an activist, and a really fun character. I liked her a lot. And we're kind of looking at how the past and present sections interact. I thought this was a really interesting novel that looked at history and culture and identity in a really interesting way. Really great characterization as well. I think I was probably a lot more invested in the present day storyline than in the past storyline. I think partly because I really enjoyed Winona and Johnny, two of the characters in the present day section, and I was kind of more invested in them than I was in anyone in the past. But overall, I thought it was a really, really interesting read. And yeah, definitely one I'd recommend. Then I also read Sea Throper by Benjamin Wood, which I did love. I liked it. Like, I enjoyed the reading experience, but I feel like this was a very forgettable book for me. It's a very quiet novel spanning sort of 24 hours, following a young man in 1950s England who works sort of hauling shrimp out of the sea, and the action of the book kind of revolves around his interaction with an American Hollywood film director who comes to see the beach, sort of scouting for locations for a film. And I just found this book a bit unfocused and a bit too quiet for me. I basically feel like this was just too literary for my taste, and yeah, it didn't wow me. As I said, I enjoyed the reading experience, but I just don't think this was my cup of tea. And yes, full review down below. Then I read 3 crime thrillers in March, which I really enjoyed. So one is The Game is Murder by Hazel Ward. This is a murder mystery book that is also like a deconstruction of the murder mystery novel and the genre of murder mysteries. So it's a very strange book, but I really liked it. And I think in comparison to something like The Seven Deaths at Evelyn Hardcastle, which is another very like premise-driven murder mystery, I found that in The Seven Deaths at Evelyn Hardcastle, the premise was really interesting, but it overshadowed the mystery, and the mystery itself wasn't that satisfying, whereas in The Game is Murder, the mystery itself is also very satisfying. And the twists and turns of the mystery I thought were done really well as it being a deconstruction of the genre. How do I explain this? So one of the first things you have in the book is a contract between the author and the reader. And then like the first section is written in second person, like you are the detective at a murder mystery party having to solve a case. And then various other sections do various different things. And it's very, very meta, breaking the fourth wall a lot, which I don't think will be for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun. And all of this kind of revolves around a crime that happened many decades before, where it has always been assumed that a man killed his nanny, mistaking his nanny for his wife, and meant to kill his wife. That's what his wife has always said. He has vanished and never been seen since, so he's never gone on trial. And this book is kind of saying, is he guilty or not? And yeah, just thought this was a really, really interesting read. Talking of crime thrillers that do interesting things with form, I also read You Don't Know Me by Imran Mahmood, which is a contemporary crime thriller, all told in the form of a summing up closing speech at a trial. So the idea is that the narrator is a young man who is on trial for murder, and he basically sacks his QC, his barrister, before the closing speech and does the closing speech himself. And this whole book is him telling the story of what happened and how he came to be in some way involved in this person's death, but how he was not the person who pulled the trigger, and everything kind of goes on from there. I thought this was a really interesting book, very tense, very pacey, really, really interesting look at London gang culture, with the 3 main characters not being in gangs and not like really involved in that, but being like on the edges of that world, and how that really affects their lives and sort of drags them in and puts them in danger. So yeah, just a really interesting novel with an interesting form, well worth your time. I also read Flat 401 by Kingsley Pearson, another contemporary crime thriller. This one is about a young man called Jay who has come out of prison and is on probation, and he's coming towards the end of his probation, at which point he's hoping to kind of build a new life for himself, but we know from the beginning that while he was not guilty of the thing he went to prison for, there is something else he is guilty of. We know that he knew something about something that happened in Flat 401 that ended up leaving a man dead. Meanwhile, we're also following the sister of the man who died, and her sort of spiraling in her attempts to find someone to blame. We're also following a woman called Kathy who lives in the same hostel as Jay, who is a survivor of domestic violence. And I thought Kathy's plotline was done so well. I really, really liked her as a character and her sort of complex friendship with Jay. I really enjoyed this. It's very tense, it's very pacey. And I know Kingsley in real life, and so I knew like certain plot elements in the book, but even though I like knew how certain bits of the story went, it still kept me guessing all the way through, which I think is very impressive. And the characters are very, very complex. Everyone is sort of dealing with trauma in some way or another, and not in a very healthy way necessarily. And I feel like all of that was just explored very well. So yeah, really enjoy Flat 401. Talking of books by people I know in real life, I also read Wonders Never Cease by Lexi Hudson. This is Lexi's debut novel that comes out in May. I have a proof copy here. I've been friends with Lexi for a good decade now, I guess. And I was so excited that her debut novel is coming out. So this is an urban fantasy novel about a young woman called Trix, who is a ballet dancer, and she ends up being assigned a new partner, a new dance partner, Sander, and there is something about Sander that is a bit different, and we know from the beginning that he is not human, and that he is keeping that secret. And what follows is a love story, but also a complicated, tense story of danger, with like so much emotion. I just found it like really, really emotionally powerful. And I also loved the way Lexi writes about music and movement and dance. And I have like zero interest in ballet, like less than zero interest in ballet. But I found myself really invested in ballet in this book because the characters care about it, which I always think is like a really good sign of your emotional engagement in a book. Like it makes me think of when I read Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which has like a ton about surfing in it. And I just have zero interest in surfing. But because all the people in Malibu Rising care about surfing, I was like, oh yes, while I'm reading this book, I passionately care about surfing. And this was the same with dance. I just love the themes of Wonders Never Cease as well. It looks really interestingly at sexuality. Trix is asexual, though not aromantic, and I thought the way that was explored was really well done. And overall, I just absolutely love this. I would highly, highly recommend this when it comes out in May. And then I also reread Radiance by Catherine M. Valente. I didn't actually read this physical edition. I listened to the audiobook. This was my second read of Radiance. I first read it a good 7 or 8 years ago, I guess. I think I did a review of it when I first read it, so maybe I'll leave that link down below. You can see young mid-20s Katie talking very quickly about Radiance in the days before I digitally slowed down my videos. But yes, Radiance is a really, really interesting, weird novel that I love a lot. So this book is set in the 1960s, but in an alternate history version of the 1960s where space travel was discovered in like the 1910s. So it's the 1960s, but like on lots of different planets. And it's really atmospheric and also told in a really weird way. It's all about film and filmmakers. So it's told sort of in the form of transcripts and interviews and voiceovers and correspondence. And the sort of plot of it, I guess, revolves around the disappearance of a director on another planet and people trying to work out what happened to her. It's just so meta and so weird, but so fun, and I really like it a lot. Okay, one book more. I also read in March Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I actually started reading this several months ago. I got the audiobook out of the library and then it was due back and I didn't manage to finish it. So I picked it up again this month when my hold finally came back in and read it all and really, really enjoyed it. I thought this was a really powerful, complex novel with really great characterization. Enter Ghost is about a British Palestinian woman who is an actress. She lives and works in London, but her sister lives in Haifa in Israel. And she ends up going to see her sister for the summer and ends up getting involved in a production of Hamlet being put on in Arabic in the West Bank. And the book looks at the course of this play, the people she meets while taking part in this play, her relationship with her sister, how they both feel about being Palestinian, how differently and complexly they feel about that. And of course, the book is looking at the tensions between Israel and Palestine in a really complicated way. It's a really, really powerful novel with a lot of really fascinating themes that I just thought was done fantastically. Like, I think it's a slightly more literary book than is my usual taste. Like, I think I would probably place it in the same like literary fiction category as Sea Scraper. They're both a bit literary but also relatively accessible. But I just found it like a much more cohesive book than Sea Scraper. Sea Scraper has a lot of different themes, but I didn't quite feel they all sort of meshed together and I didn't quite know where the focus was and I felt like it needed more of a focus, whereas Enter Ghost felt, yeah, like all the themes just worked really well together and complemented each other and the character relationships sort of worked with the themes really well. Enter Ghost is a really powerful novel that is really worth a read because it's a great novel with fantastic characterization and really good themes. But I also think it's a really eye-opening novel, so I would highly recommend Enter Ghost, and I'm glad that I finally got to finish it. So those are the books that I read in March. I feel like I had a very good reading month. Do let me know what you read in March, if you had any particularly good books this month. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.